Welcome to today's event. I am Sophia Russak, and I'm a researcher here at CEPS and the chair of today's debate. We will speak about the Conference on the Future of Europe today and its consequences, and we will do so in two steps. We will first look back a bit. So at the past 4 to 5 months, what has happened in the time since May, since the conference concluded? And then in the second step, look ahead a bit. What can we expect now regarding treaty change and institutional reform? Where do the individual institutions, so the member states, the council, the member states, the commission and the parliament, where do they stand on these issues currently? And to discuss those two packages of topics, we have a strong panel with us today here. Our first speaker is Anna Lührmann. She is the Minister of State for Europe in the Foreign Ministry of Germany. Our second speaker is Daniel Freund. He is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. And our third speaker is Nikolai von Ondarza. He's a senior researcher and leading the EU team at SWP. So thanks to you three for being here with us today. And if you have a question to one of our speakers, then please type it into the Q&A box and I will try to pick it up. Please indicate also who you would like to answer your question. We have 1 hour, so I would suggest that we kick off our first block right away. Daniel, in May, all of us heard the sentence a lot that the ultimate success of the conference will hinge on its follow-up. So now it's September, and of course we would like to know, how did this implementation go so far? Can you bring us maybe a little bit up to speed what has happened since May, or also what has not happened and how you assess this? The floor is yours.
Thanks for bringing us together and for having me on this. Indeed, we all heard the speeches on the 9th of May in the plenary of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and well, the European Parliament has pretty immediately followed up already. A few days later in the plenary, we passed a resolution committing to follow up all those recommendations. You all remember. I think it was 48 chapters, right? 325 measures that were adopted by the conference. And we reaffirmed in the parliament that indeed for us, it's not only about putting them on display in the European House of History, but that we want to implement these recommendations. And actually, we have since, at least for those where we do have a right of initiative, because you also know the European Parliament cannot legislate. Well, we cannot initiate legislation ourselves. That's up for the Commission to come with proposals. But on treaty change, we have the right of initiative. Article 48 of the EU Treaties allow the Parliament to trigger that, and we have done that. And we have said, you know, it needs obviously legislation. It needs probably changes to the budget and rules of procedure, maybe in the parliament, maybe in the council, can take care of some things. But obviously the biggest recommendations, if you want, the things that would bring about the most fundamental change among those things that the citizens, but also everyone else was in the conference, has suggested, those need treaty change. And therefore, while we have pulled the trigger, so to speak, we would like to see a convention to have a broader debate on how would those treaty changes actually look like, because the recommendations of the conference, many of them were still fairly broad. Now we would have to delve into what does it mean concretely, what are the amendments to be done to the treaties, and the Parliament stands ready, and actually with a broad majority, right? Because all these decisions in the Parliament were taken with a majority that included the Conservatives, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, the Greens, the Left. So it's broadly carried. And well, now we're waiting for the second step in this procedure, which needs to be taken in the Council.
Was it a success, the conference?
I think the testing of this new tool of randomly selected citizen participation at the EU level where lots of people were hesitant in the beginning. Can that actually work in 24 languages and so on? I think this worked remarkably well. I think that for the first time we had a real space to talk among national MPs and governments and European civil society. I think that was a success. I think that the recommendations are strong, and many of the solutions identified, are more pressing than ever in situation of war, of energy crisis, of inflation. We need those fundamental reforms. So the conference, I think, was a success, but one big factor still to be determined is, do we just get recommendations or do we get actual change? And I think that bit, sort of the follow-up, that's still under question. But I would still say that the conference as such, I think it was very good that we did it, and it was a success. Yeah.
So same old, actually, same issues as in May. We don't know yet whether it was a success because the implementation is not quite clear yet. What could have gone better from your perspective?
I mean, obviously, we could have already started the convention, but I think, Anna is going to speak in more detail on where the discussions in the council are. But if you would have asked, in the council, how many member states are willing to open up the treaties and even have a discussion 2 years ago, I think there wasn't really any government that wanted that. And that we have that debate today, I think, is already a success that wouldn't have been possible out of the conference. Now the question is, how quickly can we take the next steps and actually start discussing concrete amendments to the treaties?
Minister Luhrmann, you've been here in Brussels actually last week for the General Affairs Council meeting. And among other things, you have also discussed the conference and the follow-up. And so I'm wondering, how has this exercise been recognized on member state level? So has your own government picked up those recommendations? And what have you heard from other governments?
Yes, the debate definitely continues. So that already is a success, because I think the worst outcome would have been if sort of in May the process would have just stopped and all the recommendations would have disappeared in some drawer and or filing cabinet somewhere. So we've basically had this issue of follow-up on the Conference on the Future of Europe basically in every council meeting now, basically since I joined the council in December. And there is one clear consensus that there needs to be a follow-up, that the recommendations need to be taken serious, and particularly those that are a bit reluctant to talk about treaty changes emphasize all the time that it's super important that on those issues where we don't need treaty change, which is the majority of the recommendations of the Conference on the Future of Europe, citizens should have detailed feedback, and EU institutions should work on the implementation of these recommendations. So that's that let's say the declaration of political will that this happens has been made now a couple of times, and I think there's a broad consensus that this should happen. We have several documents now structuring this work. Unfortunately, there's one document from the Commission, one from the Council, basically separating proposals into proposals that need that could be implemented right away, or that would need treaty changes, for instance. And I think now is really the moment to agree on some sort of work program, who could implement what and where. The Commission has done that a bit in now the State of the Union address. I mean, von der Leyen has repeatedly emphasized that, and some points she wants to implement recommendations of the Conference on the Future of Europe. For instance, that the Commission plans now to hold regularly citizens panels, which I think is great. And I hope that these citizens panels will be on concrete questions with concrete outcomes. That I think is a great idea. I hear one of the first ones is supposed to be on food waste, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's an ideal topic to be discussed in these kind of citizen panels. And if we learn one lesson from the Conference on the Future of Europe, I think it was that it was a good start for more also direct citizens engagement, but that questions I think, and structures need to be specified in advance more clearly and more consensually also by the institutions, so that we don't spend so much time talking about structures and rules of procedures, and that also from the get-go it's clear what happens with results afterwards. So I think that's very clear. And then there will be a follow-up event on in early December that is already agreed by the institutions as well. I think the details are not very clear, and now the important thing is that the preparations for this event are really done in a way that we can clearly say, okay, of this recommendation, this one is being done here, that one is being done here, or this one doesn't work, or we don't have a political majority, so we should really work with those recommendations. Now that is important. And then, of course, we also have the debate about the treaty changes that could result out of also discussions in the conference. And here, unfortunately, again, last week, it was very clear that the appetite is very, very low. I'm afraid with the probable change in the Italian government is even lower. But a debate that clearly takes momentum now is a debate about institutional improvements that don't need treaty changes. So, for example, the use of the passerelle for more qualified majority voting in the fields of foreign and security policy. I think that is an issue where also where there could be quite a good dynamic happening also in the coming months.
Thanks. You, I think when member states agree that there needs to be follow-up, this remains very vague, right? Nobody's really surprised by this, I guess. The work program you mentioned sounds a bit more promising, and you say that it should happen. But now my question to you, do you think it will happen? Is it realistic? And B, who will draft it?
Yeah, that is exactly the issue now between the institutions, because, I mean, first of all, there we have a list now also of things that the council could just do, basically, or that individual member states could do. So there needs to be a process to follow up on this. And then, of course, there are certain other things. My suggestion was always that it would make sense now to move, for example, the issues that are on, let's say, animal welfare, really to the respective council formation and the respective committees in the parliament, the respective commissioner, and then have a discussion about where we stand, and then have a joint feedback to the citizens. But this, unfortunately, until now hasn't gotten much momentum. So the question is really sort of who is who's working exactly also on bringing the institutions together to give a response to citizens. But I'm a bit confident because we have at least agreed on this date now of 2nd December, and I think everyone will want to avoid the embarrassment of standing there empty-handed in front of the citizens. So I hope that this some more dynamic will now pick up.
And what is the rationale of this event? What is the purpose?
The purpose is to give feedback on what has happened and what will happen in the future on the proposals. That's the whole idea. So we better get some work done before that.
All right. Thank you very much. Nikolai, let us move on to you. Share with us your thoughts on the follow-up so far, but maybe you can also go one step back a bit further and tell us a bit more about your assessment on the overall conference.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm excited to be here in this debate, and I would maybe add 3 points. First, if you ask me to look a little bit back, I think it's important to stress on that the conference basically was devised in a different era. If we think back, it was promised by Commission President von der Leyen in September, I think, 2019. So that was before COVID, before Next Generation EU and the joint EU borrowing, was before the Ukraine war, before the revitalization of EU enlargement policy. So basically, while the conference was later on going on, Europe changed around the conference and not because of the conference. And so a lot of things happened in the last 2 years that we basically would have said that were impossible on the EU stage to happen when the conference was initially proposed. And so I think it's important to stress how much Europe is already on the move and how many different debates are coming together, where the conference can only sort of slide in, but what was not the main driver. And my second point, that if we look at the changes here, and the different tensions between the institutions, but also between member states in the council, I think it's fair to say that the conference was not successful in really getting these tensions out of the system. So shortly before the conference was launched, there was this non-paper by 12 EU member states saying we should not go for treaty change, there should be a limited mandate, and the conference should be mostly for engaging with the citizens. At the end of the conference, you had a non-paper by 13 member states saying the conference should not be used for treaty change and a bigger institutional debate. And basically, these 12 and 13 member states were mostly the same, with Poland joining later on. And I think you could now probably add Italy to the list. So there was not a real change in the tensions. The same thing about the European Parliament, which initially called for treaty change to be on the agenda of the conference and a wider mandate. And as Daniel said in the beginning, as a follow-up call for a convention and treaty change. So the conference, despite this very complex made up of all the three major institutions, the citizens panels, and this very long process, was not able to resolve these tensions. So I think it's fair to say that the main task, what the conference should do, to form a consensus towards where Europe should move, that we were not successful in achieving that. And the third point I want to make is about the citizen engagement. I think the conference told us about what works in citizens engagement and what doesn't work. And I think what doesn't work was a wider public debate about EU constitutional change. Where I think even in the so-called Brussels bubble, the conference rarely figured very highly, even during the main times of the debate. And I think the public online platform also attracted only either very hardcore pro-Europeans or very hardcore anti-Europeans. What I think did work were the representative citizens panels, which really came up with interesting ideas, came up with very well thought out through proposals for how the EU should develop. And I think this should be what we look upon the major outcome of the conference, where we can learn about how to develop the EU further. And their main points, I think, were about an EU that takes on more responsibility in core tasks, on the Green Deal, the energy transformation, more sustainable agriculture. So a lot of proposals on the core task of where the EU is already working on, and a big call for more citizens engagement and more transparency and a more open EU. And I think these are the calls that we should focus on if we look about the follow-up of the conference, the discussion. We will get to that in the second part. I think it would be a devaluation of the conference if we just focus on the question treaty change or not. Whereas the majority of the citizens' proposal really go into where can the EU take on more responsibility where it's already working well. And I think this should be the task of the EU institutions, to actually give a follow-up there and separate that from the discussion, as maybe you have done today, on treaty change. Because if we only sort of judge the success of the conference on the question, are the treaties opened or not, then I think we will not get to a successful answer.
Concretely, what could have done better? What could the EU institutions have done better in your view? Also, maybe, you know, for future exercises of such sort, what would you tease out as a few rough lessons learned?
So I would, first of all, say make it much less complex, so that institutional hybrid structure where basically all EU organizations had to have their seat at the table, for me, did not add much value. I think the focus should have been the citizens panels and the citizens engagement, and base the conference around that and feed that then into the normal institutional framework. I think the whole hybrid structure around the conference was too much. The second point is give them more time. So the conference was started a year later, but did not go a year longer because it, for political reasons, needed to end right before the presidential elections in France. And I think that didn't help the conference, but rather give them more time. I think 2 years would have been suitable better. And then thirdly, organize this follow-up by the institutions together and not each institutions for itself. I think they would have helped to get a joint answer from the EU institutions to the proposals from the citizens, rather than this institutional tug war that we have today with different institutions outlining their priorities and giving their individual answers to the demands of the citizens.
Thank you, Nikolai. I'm looking at the questions that I'm getting in from our audience, and here's one question that I would like to pose to Minister Luhrmann. Dimitri Korpakis from Brussels says, instead of trying to change the treaties from the top, could it be simpler to focus on the greater possible diffusion of citizens' proposals using all media possible, so that finally national parties integrate a sizable part of them? As I understand the question, basically, could we not implement those recommendations on national instead of EU level?
I would understand the question differently. It's more about sort of a political campaign, I would argue, but maybe, I mean, there are several aspects to this question. First of all, indeed, one of the big points of the citizens in doing the conference was to say that Europe needs to communicate better with citizens, and that also we need to have more trans-European media, more information also about values and issues connected to European values and all this, or campaigns also. So I think that's, for me, that's one of the takeaway points from the conference, that we really should put more emphasis here. For example, with this proposal of a European media platform to really make quality news available to everyone, that this could be ways of addressing this. Then on the issue of how how we mobilize for reforms in Europe, I think really we sort of need to work on all different ends. There can indeed be sort of a bottom-up campaign coming from including national parties, maybe also the trans-European parties, of course, party families, and to that end would be great if we could finally get those transnational lists, where we have a proposal on the table as well at the moment. So indeed, that is always a way. And I'm actually looking at the majorities. That's actually a puzzle that I haven't been able to solve until now. Maybe Daniel, you know the answer. If we look at the majorities in favor of a convention in the European Parliament, and at how national governments behave in the council, then I sometimes really wonder, sort of, these European parliamentarians also come from some countries. So why don't they manage to put more pressure on their national governments to work accordingly in the council then in the end? So I think sort of everyone needs to work a bit better together here to have sort of a movement for these EU integration friendly policies.
Dani, would you like to respond to that?
No, I agree with the issue. I mean, there is clearly parties around Europe where the members in the European Parliament are all pushing for, we want the convention, and then their colleagues back in the capitals of some of the member states are blocking the thing. It's, you know, I mean, now there's a change in government in Sweden, for example, but the previous Swedish government was really one of the more difficult ones when it came to many of these changes. And the Europe minister even sat on the board of the conference, blocking things till the very end. And the Social Democrats in the European Parliament are at the very forefront of, you know, promoting these things. So that's also why I'm a bit, I mean, obviously we need this. We need the bottom-up push on parties across Europe as well for this kind of change. But given that we have such a large majority already in the European Parliament for this, it's the crux is more that, you know, governments are all democratically elected, but they are not elected for the, you know, their main task of national government is not Europe. Yet they then sit in the council and very much shape European decision making, be it on treaty change or on legislative change for their time in office. And this is still something that we have to struggle with time and again. When things find very large majorities in the European Parliament, but get stuck in the council. And I mean, Anna Lührmann mentioned the electoral law, where I think it's particularly, frustrating from a point of view of someone sitting in the European Parliament. This concerns the election to the European Parliament. You might think, this is not the biggest concern for member states' governments. Yet it is the member states' governments that are hindering us in the European Parliament from changing the way that we elect the European Parliament next time around.
Very quick follow-up, Dani. I get a question whether the EP, so AFCO, is actually working on a comprehensive report on treaty revision. Very quick answer from you on this?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then Nikolai, so now this is an exercise for your memory, which those 30 member states which are opposing any treaty change, plus probably Italy, who are those? Maybe we can get them together.
I don't know if I can rattle off the whole list, but it's basically mostly either Northern or Central and Eastern European member states. So I know that I think Denmark coordinated that then non-paper. There was the Baltics were on that list. Sweden and Finland were already mentioned. Poland was on that, and several other Central and Eastern member states. As far as I know, none of the sort of Western European countries, neither sort of Germany, France, Italy, Spain, or so on, were on that list. And I think the only one that really changed sides was the Netherlands, which signed the original 12-country non-papers before the conference and didn't sign afterwards because of a change within the coalition government. But I would need to check the full list to rattle it down. But mostly Central and Eastern Europe. And maybe it's important to say that there was a sort of a follow-up paper by 6 Western European countries, including Germany, Italy, and several of the Benelux countries, saying that they are at least open for treaty change. And the interesting thing is, if you add the population number of these countries plus France, which hold the presidency at the time, they were a majority of the EU population represented calling for openness for treaty change, while the countries against treaty change, the 13 plus Hungary, are just about the majority of member states. So there's a balance that the smaller member states were more critical of treaty change, and the larger countries more open towards it.
Thanks for this very interesting addition, Nikolai. Let's look a bit ahead and talk about treaty and institutional change. The EP wants a convention. The President of the European Commission supported it now in her State of the Union address. Member states seem reluctant, so nothing really new here, or is there? I would like to hear from all three of you, your assessment from your respective positions and perspectives, what is needed and what is likely. Minister Lührmann, can you share with us a little bit, again, what your own government's position, and also how you perceive the overall atmosphere in Council and European Council on these topics?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we already discussed it also a bit, but sure. I mean, we've stated it very clearly also in our coalition treaty that in principle, we would like to see a European Convention because we think that the treaties need an update, and particularly for us to be ready for enlargement. I mean, we're talking about an EU that we want to see with more with like around 35 members, right? And I find it very difficult to comprehend how we could have such a union with the current institutional rules. And also this kind of of a discussion could also help us to really address some of the issues that were identified also in the conference on the future of Europe. For instance, that we can use the rule of law mechanisms also when it comes to infringements of other core values of the EU, that we can use that also maybe with different majorities, so earlier and more effectively, and these kind of things. So there are just so many things that we need to talk about. On the other hand, we've clearly seen that this kind of thinking is indeed not common among a majority of member states, and therefore, where the sort of given the current discussion in the Council, we think it's best to find ways of achieving at least as much of reform as possible. And as I said earlier, here really the existing treaties already allow for quite a bit of flexibility that isn't used yet. So for instance, using the passerelle clauses to come to more qualified majority voting, I think that would be a very good next step, particularly to get ready for enlargement. And here I see a bit more of an appetite among also maybe those member states that wouldn't say, yes, this is now our top priority, but at least there's not such a sort of stop sign as to the discussion of having a convention now at this very moment. So I think we can have quite a constructive debate about that, and the Czech presidency has already started that. They have asked member states to share their positions on this with them. We want to moderate a debate now, and I think here we really also need to start being a bit creative to really address the concerns also of smaller member states and find good common ground to at least make some sort of progress here in the coming 6 or 12 months and during this term of the Parliament. Yeah.
And in which fields do you think such expansion of QMV would be realistic from what you've discussed so far with your council colleagues?
Well, I think the field of sanctions, because it became very clear. I mean, we were quite capable to act as EU with now the 8th sanction package on the table, but it's also very clear that this process was repeatedly stalled mainly by one member state, and that is a problem. That also is a problem for the EU's capability to act, to send a clear message towards Russia. And I think this message really, or the sentiment is shared in many capitals, also in Central and Eastern Europe, that we shouldn't allow any single country to block a decisive response vis-a-vis Russia now in this case. So, and also then thinking about now an EU with like 35 members, it can also, we just have to think about the possibility that a third country has a huge influence on one of these member states, or 2 or 3. And we cannot let that block the EU from acting in decisive foreign policy matters. So I think sort of sanctions and other issues maybe in the field of common foreign and security policy could really be one where we could see progress.
Can we expect a debate and also a decision on the European Parliament's proposal or call for a convention in one of the next European Council meetings? October is the next one, and I think December is the one after. When do you expect a decision made there?
Well, that is still being discussed as far as I understand, and there are quite some people who think that we need to wait for the report of this committee in the European Parliament before we can have a serious debate about it in the Council. I'm not sure about when to expect that. The latest I heard was that it might take until February, but maybe Daniel knows more about that. So that's an issue. But then also in general, I mean, in the Council, sort of, we've had debates about this now, basically. Almost every General Affairs Council session, sort of on the follow-up of the conference, and then that was then sort of led mainly to everyone repeating the statement that everyone already knew from others. So there will be more debates definitely, but until now I'm not 100% sure when, how, and where.
Thank you. Daniel, let me lead over to you then. And the first question, when this AFCO report is going to be prepared and ready. And then also, please tell us a bit more how the atmosphere is at the moment in the Parliament. The resolution was in June, I think, right? So what are the expectations right now within the Parliament?
So, I mean, first of all, I would agree with the view that, you know, the conference took place mostly still in another era. The situation has changed dramatically further since then. In the area of energy, inflation, we see a crisis coming to European economies that certainly weren't on the horizon to this extent during our debate in the conference. And that's also why we in the Parliament, we still feel, I mean, by all means, let's explore passerelle clauses and such. And if we can make a quick reform, that's great. But something like a proper talk about what is the EU competence on energy, how do we reply to the current challenges in a unified way, not every member state just for itself, I think is a debate that we need to have. And you know, it seems that there are a number of governments in the council that say, look, now there's crisis, not the time to have this debate. But in a way, Europe goes through crisis after crisis, you know, economic financial crisis, migration, Brexit, Corona, now the war. I think it's about time to draw the lessons from that and make sure that Europe is actually capable of answering to those crises. And therefore, we still think that the convention is the way to go. I think many of us also feel that, you know, we need a broader reform package on the table to actually have material for compromise, for, you know, to strike a big bargain. Money certainly helps with something like that. And we all know that money is needed to weather the current energy crisis in particular. So, I mean, we have triggered Article 48, so the expectation from the Parliament is that, you know, now it's up to the Council. We are still working on, you know, a more detailed position for when and if that convention comes. But I think, I mean, our current thinking is that first we would like to see what the Council, I mean, we have put concrete amendments to the treaty on the table for discussion. So we first want to see an answer to that before taking the next step. So that's, I think, the thinking in the Parliament. And one last sentence just on this question of large versus small member states. I think, I mean, all EU countries in comparison to the US or China we're all small countries, right? My own member state is small in comparison to Russia. So for me, really, the question that we have to address in this convention is ultimately about sovereignty, and there still seems to be an illusion of national sovereignty for European member states, where I am convinced that we have no sovereignty on questions like climate change, like taxation of global companies, like security in Europe, or also questions like migration. The only chance to still have sovereignty on those is at the European level. So whether we come from bigger or smaller, or, you know, small or very small member states, if you want, it doesn't really matter. Either we work together on these questions, or we have no working solutions. And I think particularly in times of war, that needs to be clear to everyone. If it's, you know, if Putin needs to flip one in the European Council, we're just making it too easy for him. Then we're not gonna be good supporters of Ukraine. We're not going to be able to win this if we're so easily divided. So we need to address this question of unanimity first and foremost.
Looking at the new likely Swedish and Italian governments, would it be desirable to open the treaties at the moment, Daniel?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we shouldn't make that dependent on one government or the other. There's constantly an election somewhere. There's constantly a government changing in one or the other direction somewhere in Europe. I don't think we can make Europe dependent on whatever is currently going on in one or the other member state. We also know that last time around we did this between the convention 2001 and the moment that the treaty then entered into force in 2009. It took 8 years. Not that I want this to take this long, but if we are at the beginning of a longer process, I mean, who knows who is going to be in the Italian government, even in a few months' time? Who knows what happens in other member states? But clearly, what I see, the reason why Italians voted the way they voted, and why there was the risk in France and 40% voting for the extreme right there as well, is because Europe doesn't deliver the kind of answers that citizens want Europe to give. It's a feeling of, disempowerment, of not being able to control global forces. And I think the actual answer to those concerns that it seems a large number of Europeans have, I think, is that we empower Europe to give those answers and to regain some of that sovereignty that I mentioned. So I think, yes, the right answer to what is going on in Italy is precisely to reinforce European collaboration, to reinforce a social Europe, and to make sure that we can deal with things like a drought like we have never seen before that affects many Italians in particular.
Do you see such process triggered before the EP elections in 24?
I mean, we have triggered it.
Yeah, sorry.
Do I now see that the convention happens before the elections? Difficult to say. But I think, it needs to come. We in the European Parliament will continue to push for it and try to convince people of the necessity. But will it now happen in 6 months or in 12 months or in 24 months? I don't know. But I'm convinced that, the debate is coming.
Thanks, Tanya. Nikolai, has the time come for a convention? As also the Commission President believes, how do you see the chances?
Probably not yet. I think it's first important to say Daniel stressed a lot the sovereignty of member states and the questions whether they can only achieve that sovereignty as jointly on the European level or nationally. But one area where their sovereignty is not disputed is that they are still the masters of the treaties at the European level. And I think treaty change can only happen if we get full ownership from EU member states. As far as I know, there has been no successful push for treaty change that didn't come from the member states. And in the history of European integration, there was only one instance where I think the UK was outvoted on launching an intergovernmental conference on the Single European Act in the 80s against Ms. Thatcher, where at the end it was possible to get an unanimous support for their treaty change. And in all other instances, from the very get-go, all member states were on board. And I think we cannot launch a convention if there's even a third of the EU member states against it. Maybe against 1 or 2 member states, which you can pack in a package deal at the end of the convention. But it can only work if the majority, and at best all member states, are for a convention from the outset. And this is not going to happen before the end of this European Parliament. But I'm a little bit more optimistic that this might happen if you combine it with the question of enlargement, of the question of an EU of 35 countries, where even those countries who are skeptical of treaty change and institutional reforms will probably get more of the arguments for why the EU needs to reform to be still workable if we are talking about 30, 35 plus countries. The second point I want to make is on the passerelle clause, which is very interesting, but not that much easier than treaty change. You still need anonymity. to get away from anonymity. So you need all member states on the table. And a lot of member states still have also national conditions. For instance, in Germany, you need a 2/3 majority of the Bundesrat and the Bundestag. And so it's not that much easier and not that much cheaper. If you look at who's being outvoted in recent years, since the UK left, Hungary is the most outvoted country in the Council of the EU. Now imagine how costly it will be in terms of a package deal to get Hungary to support giving up that veto in foreign affairs or even in other areas. So everybody who calls for passerelle clause also needs to answer the question, what are you willing to give Hungary on other countries in order to give up their veto in so crucial areas? And I think this is the question that we need to answer if we want to look at a quick use of passerelle clause in foreign affairs or in other policy areas.
Thank you. Could you make a guess? What does the Commission want? Because von der Leyen expressed support now, but to be honest, it was a bit, it didn't seem overly excited to me, let's say, but yet she mentioned it in this speech where she did not have to, I find, topic-wise. Is there more to this than, charming the EP for re-election? What is your take on this?
I would guess the second one, charming the EP for election. She gave the Conference on the Future of Europe basically as an election promise to the European Parliament in 2019. Then throughout the process, I think the Commission wasn't very active. It wanted to play more the role of a moderator and didn't get too deep into the disputes between the European Parliament and the large parts of the Council. And even here in her speech, she could have given more answers on the follow-up on the Conference on the Future of Europe, but chose only very vaguely at the end to speak in favor of a convention. So I think this is more sort of feeling of the waters in the European Parliament, maybe a promise to get it on the side. But I would be very surprised if the Commission really put its weight behind starting a convention process before the end of this European Parliament, specifically given the way the discussions, at least from the outside, seem to have gone in the Council so far.
Minister Löhmann, there's a question of Eva Lichtenberger, and it goes in a similar direction to the one that I just asked to Daniel, so I would like to play this also to you. Do you think that the results of the Italian elections will have an impact on the process?
Well, most probably yes, because the Italian government was actually one of the ones, so let's say the most pro-federalist government that we had sort of as an ally in this process during the last 6-7 months. So this will definitely change, and the rest of the impact on European policies remains to be seen, but we also have a clear statement, for instance, from the Hungarian government saying, yeah, we're open for a convention actually, but we would like to see less competencies in Brussels than instead of more. So this is, I mean, one of the issues, and indeed we need to embark on a process like a convention. We need to have a bit of a common understanding in Europe where this should go. We could also, of course, also say that we hope that during this kind of process, this consensus emerges, but in the end, it needs to go through Parliament, through ratification, and some people still have here the memories of the last process, but I'm not that skeptical when it comes to the use of the passerelle clause. Indeed, it's a bit like squaring the circle, getting unanimity in order to remove unanimity. But if it's a clear limited area like this, I think really, and it's so clearly linked here to the issue of enlargement, and it's so clearly linked also to recent political events. I think this dynamic can be achieved, in particular also if, and here I come back to what I said earlier, what somebody asked earlier, if there's also some pressure from civil society and parties across Europe for this issue, then I think we can achieve something here.
Daniel Jean-Guy Giraud asks whether you can be a bit more specific about the EP AFCO follow-up on treaty revision. Is this possible?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it possible? Yeah, I mean, we can trigger treaty change whenever we want. That's what the treaty says.
No. I'm sorry. Is it possible? That was my mistake. Is it possible for you to go a bit more into detail?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, what we're doing now is obviously, I mean, we have the list of recommendations from the conference. We know that there's about 20 or so that would require treaty change, and we have started looking into, I mean, in our opening sort of in the Article 48 trigger that we did and sent to the Council, we included, I think in the end, I don't even know, 2-3 concrete amendments. What we're doing now is translating the other ones into concrete treaty amendments as well. So I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel. These are things that came from the conference and were broadly discussed, but things like, Anna and I were both in the working group on values and rule of law. One of the recommendations was that the European Charter of Fundamental Rights becomes universally applicable. So now we're looking into how do you actually do that? What is the concrete amendment you would have to do something like that? And it's not just changing a word or two. It's legally speaking, it needs a bit more work than that. So that's the kind of things that we have started in the Parliament to look into a bit more concretely how those amendments could look like. It's not new content. This is all on the table already in the conference conclusions. It's just how do you translate that into treaty amendments?
Thanks. Nikolai, one question of Marco Schwarz from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in Brussels. Concerning the letters, statements by member states opposing or supporting treaty change, why do we see again a division between Central and Eastern countries and Europe's North and Western European countries? What can the West offer in order to get treaty change done? Why should Poland or Hungary agree to move to QMV? Do you have a guess?
I think the answer is that they fear a domination by Germany and France in the Western European countries in EU affairs, that they are more skeptical in general in Central and Eastern Europe, but I think also in Northern Europe, of deeper European integration in areas that they want to reserve for national sovereignty, and where they are especially let's say, critical of the move towards QMV. And you can see that if you look, we recently looked at the numbers, and France and Italy are hardly ever outvoted in QMV, Germany a little bit more often, but in recent times it's most often this Central and Eastern European countries who are outvoted. So they are, I think, out of their experience, more critical towards that move. And I think, sort of, I said that in my last answer, where we have a little bit of a chance to change that dynamic is if we combine the discussions about QMV and about enlargement, because these are precisely the countries who are in favor of a quick accession of Ukraine and more countries from the Western Balkans, and I think would be susceptible to the argument that if you want an EU of 30 plus countries, you also need to change at least the decision-making procedures for that. And I think this is a better route towards that reform than just building upon the conference on the future of Europe. And I hope that this is how the dynamic changes in the upcoming months. If we say further enlargement is realistic in the next 10 years, then we need to start the discussion about treaty change. I think now also in a framework, how can that be done in the next 5 to 10 years in order to bring these two strands together and maybe also these different camps in the EU together?
Can I say one sentence?
Of course.
Yeah. Because Morawiecki, the Polish prime minister, had an op-ed in a German newspaper recently where he explained why he's against getting rid of national vetoes. And one of the core examples he mentioned was that previous German government made the mistake of agreeing to Nord Stream 2. And I actually think that his analysis of that case is exactly the wrong way around. So he says, you need to preserve national vetoes because then Germany cannot force these kind of mistakes onto everyone else. And I actually think that if at the time, we as Greens were against Nord Stream 2 from the beginning, but if there would have been a vote in the council on saying, is this a good thing for Europe or not? If it was by majority, Germany would have been outvoted and Nord Stream 2 wouldn't have been built. Whereas if you preserve the national veto, then Germany would have vetoed any sort of attempt by the Europeans to even take a stance on it. So I think precisely also if you think, that those kind of mistakes shouldn't happen in the future, then I think your conclusion should be, let's take those decisions with majority in Europe.
Yes, Minister Löhmann.
Yes, exactly. And in addition to that, just looking at when the veto right was exercised in the council is not enough, because typically sort of what happens in the council is sort of negotiations under the threat of the veto, right? And these negotiations happen differently than if there wouldn't be the possibility to threaten with this veto. That's the whole point. Typically one avoids. So typically these things are then not even brought to a vote. So therefore, I think we also have a lot of room for compromise when it comes to the use of the passerelle clause now, to at least not having this in the final vote, not giving this right to veto, but maybe to have some sort of a cascade moment before that.
All right, so we have 2 minutes left, and I would like to go around one more time and ask you three to answer very quickly. Just for us as observers of EU politics, what do we have to pay attention to in the near future? What events, what happenings, what moments are decisive for those two issues we talked about today? So the further implementation of the recommendation of the conference recommendations and potential treaty and institutional change. Daniel, what is your answer?
Well, the Czech presidency told us there's a GAC discussion coming in October, potential vote in the General Affairs Council in November. If that goes well, it can be put to the leaders in December. That's the optimistic, fast track scenario the Czechs have outlined to us. So I guess those are the 3 moments to watch.
Minister Löhmann, what would you like to add?
The feedback event on the 2nd of December.
Right. Nikolai, you have the last words.
So easy way out, I would say the economic situation and the war around Ukraine, which will, I think, shape the whole discussion and tell us whether there is a possibility for an onward-looking treaty change discussion. And I would only add the Czech discussion about the Czech presidency-led discussion about the passerelle clause, which I think will be the first big test whether we get unanimous support for more majority voting in the EU.
All right. We'll be all following with great interest what the next months will bring, and then eventually also the lead up to the EP elections in May 24. For now, we would like to thank our 3 speakers for sharing your thoughts and opinions and insights with us. And also, of course, many thanks to you for watching and engaging. Goodbye.